I'm Staci-lee Sherwood from Reality Checks with Staci-lee, coming to you on All About Animals Radio. Now, if you think animal issues are just about animals, well, no, they also involve politics and economics, so they affect all of us. So I hope today you learn a little something, maybe be motivated to act, and enjoy the show. So with that, my guest today is Jack Gescheidt, founder of TreeSpirit Project and consultant to a fabulous nonprofit in defense of animals. So welcome, Jack.
Thank you, Staci-lee. Great to be here.
So let's start with how you first got involved with the rare Tule Elk at the Point Reyes National Seashore.
Sure. It was actually, I credit an independent documentary filmmaker named Skylar Thomas, who made a 90-minute documentary that I saw at a vegan meetup group when I was first delving into that world in San Francisco. I live just north of the city, called The Shame of Point Reyes. And in 90 minutes, well, really in about 20 minutes, it was like, I can't believe this. I've been driving in and out of this park for the 18, 20 years I've been living in the Bay Area, originally from New York. And I learned about what's happening with Tule elk and how they are being outnumbered about 9 or 10 to 1 by cows. And that the nice little organic dairy farms that I thought, well, I didn't know what to think of them. Frankly, when you drive into Point Reyes, this pretty well-known national park unit here, just north of San Francisco, was a mix of cows and elk. And I didn't get that the cows were commercial enterprises. They were supposed to not be in the park as long as they had been, and that the elk were not just suffering, but dying as a result of competing with the industry. So I was aghast. It was really clear after the full 90 minutes of that film, The Shame of Point Reyes, and you can Google that and see it on YouTube for free these days, on YouTube. And I was just incensed. So I started getting involved. And then about 2 years into that effort, I came alongside In Defense of Animals activists working on the same issue. We got along, and then I've been doing consulting work with them as well. It's great to work with an animal rights group that they have deep roots in animal rights issues, not just Tule elk, and we collaborate together, and I do my own stuff as well.
Yeah, they really are a good group to work with. So now, for people who are not familiar with what is going on out in California with the elk at this national seashore, can you talk about the problems the elk are facing and how these dairy ranchers, which, as you said, are really not supposed to be in a national park, are impacting their survival? And even what kind of impact these dairy cows have on the ecosystem?
Sure, and it's tricky to summarize because it's easy to get dragged down the rabbit holes we will eventually go here in this longer talk. And I appreciate the platform for it. And I hope, well, if you're willing to listen to all this, it's pretty amazing. And what's going on at Point Reyes, as I say, is a microcosm for a larger issue that you wouldn't know about unless you're an animal rights person or you happen to read about the cattle industry.
Right.
But it's basically a commercial enterprise, for-profit enterprise. You know, it's America. We have for-profit enterprises called the cattle industry, which is beef and dairy production, that have staked a claim in this park because they were there for, gosh, well over 100 years, 150 years, legally, you know, ethically and all that, part of our culture. But then a deal was cut in 1962, where over the course of the next 25 years, by 1987, the federal government purchased the land that the beef and dairy ranches were on at what became Point Reyes National Seashore. And the broker deal was they would exit after 25 years. They would retire. They were given millions of dollars. In today's money, it's the equivalent of about $350 million to, I think it's about 14 families that had been there traditionally. But then as that time neared through the 80s, they did what, you know, businesses are going to do, which is, well, we don't want to leave. We're getting a great land deal here. They had leased the land back after selling it to the government to make the park. And then they just pressured politicians because the cattle industry has a lot of political muscle. And then they start rewriting the narrative too, as industries do, whether it's fossil fuels or in this case, the cattle industry, saying, well, no, we're historic stewards of the land, blah, 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 regenerative ranching, blah, 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 and just in effect have taken the money and then don't leave. And to the point of Tule elk, the result of their staying is an entire 1/3 of the entire 71,000 acres of national seashore is relegated to cattle, and only 2,600 versus 71,000 acres, the entire park, or 28,000 acres, a third, for cattle, Only 2,600 acres, a tiny amount by comparison, is set aside at the Tomales Point, the northernmost part of Point Reyes Seashore, as the Tomales Point Tule Elk Reserve. And that name is taken on Orwellian connotations because it's the opposite of a reserve or a preserve. It is an area that is increasingly drier with the climate crisis, ironically brought on in part because of cattle.
Right,
That's a whole
exactly.
thing. And that's been in the news in the last 2-3 years about the obviously perennial drought and heating climate, and then the elk in this area of the park. There are actually elk in other areas of the park too, but that's the largest herd. So that's what we're focused on for the moment. In the Tule Elk Reserve are suffering and dying because they're fenced onto this section of land, not allowed to go into the entire park of 71,000 acres, trapped behind an 8-foot tall fence that extends 3 miles across the tip of the peninsula, locking them inside this piece of land, which is drought stricken. So in the increasingly drought-stricken summers, elk can't travel south into other areas of the park to get more food and water, food being forage, vegetation, because the ranchers don't want them there. And the ranchers control the narrative in the park. They control the business in the park. The Park Service has become the proxy of the cattle industry, which basically is making the rules, which is elk are staying locked in, tough darts on them. They falsely claim it's a natural population decline, when elk trapped into a large zoo-like enclosure, we activists call it, because that's what it is in effect, suffer, die of thirst. It's a slow, excruciating death or lack of food. And we can take it from there, but that's the issue. Cattle rule the roost at Point Reyes National Seashore, and the Park Service is enslaved to the cattle industry.
And I also wanted to bring up something. I know that there were multiple lawsuits, and just for people listening who might not be aware, the Department of, I call it Department of Injustice, the DOJ, was actually in court defending the National Park Service's actions against these rare Tule elk. Is that correct?
Yes, there is one. Yeah. There are 2 lawsuits currently. One of them is my father would appreciate this. Not an activist per se, but certainly an artist and a sense of humor and an animal lover. Gescheidt, my last name, Gescheidt versus Halland, Secretary of Interior. I'm not the only plaintiff. I didn't initiate the lawsuit, but I'm one of 4 plaintiffs, 3 individuals and 1 animal rights organization that have filed suit against the federal government, in this case, the Department of Interior. Under the Department of Interior is the National Park Service. Deb Haaland runs the Department of Interior, so the suit is Gescheidt versus Haaland, and that case was brought by the Harvard Law Animal Policy. Oh gosh, I'm getting the quote wrong. What is their official name?
Harvard Law Animal Clinic, I think, or
Harvard Law Animal like Policy. It's either center or program. Forgive me.
Or Law Clinic or something
but you
like
can
that.
Google,
Yeah.
You can Google Point Reyes National Seashore Harvard Law suit, Harvard lawsuit, and there is that one lawsuit. And that's specifically addressing the what I was describing, which is elk dying inside the so-called reserve. And the National Park Service certainly has responsibility to prioritize, to put it mildly, to care for Tule elk and all wild animals in the park first, and everything else second. And right now, commercial cattle operations are prioritized to the detriment, which is to say, fancy word for deaths of hundreds, literally hundreds of Tule elk. Over 425 is a conservative number by the Park Service's own count of the Tule elk that have died in the last decade. And as the heat increases in the summers and drought increases, those numbers are going to continue to climb. Very disturbing. And that's just one of 2 lawsuits. And I can tell you about the second lawsuit when you're ready.
How many elk are currently living, an approximation, currently living in the park today?
About 500 in 3 different herds, and about half of those are in the largest herd inside the reserve. There are 2 other areas nearby where they actually, years ago, when the elk were brought in 1978, it was, I mean, that's the irony. The Park Service was the hero. They brought elk in 1978, said, hey, we're going to have a place to bring in elk. And they put them up at the Tomales Point, which wasn't as dry as it is today. And hey, great. They brought in, I think it was 10 elk from Southern California, started the herd. And it was a success story. It bred to the hundreds. And then it was so successful, they moved, again, I forget the number. It was like 14 or 15, a small number of elk, to another area called Muddy Hollow. which is south of the reserve in a greener, lusher area, a beautiful area to walk through, actually, not as well visited, not as easy to drive into. And then the herd, God bless wild animals, and it's a perfect example of the intelligence of wild animals and this relative stupidity of humankind. Who knew that they would swim across, that they could swim, or would choose to swim across Drake's Estero and establish another herd, another area where elk are now at Drake's Beach, another area in the park. So those would be two additional herds that are not fenced at Tomales Point, but are still constrained by nearby cattle operations. Wherever the elk are, they're not just free to go anywhere, because if they intrude on a cattle operation calls the Park Service and says, hey, there's elk here, we don't want them there, if they get to be a problem. And now there's a PR game, because we activists recently, one bit of good news in all this is activism works. In the last 2 to 3 years, there's been a group of activists. I'm just one of a community. In Defense of Animals is one of several groups have gotten involved in this issue and made a big noise about it, and gone in and done very dramatic demonstrations and got media attention, and kind broadcasts like yours give us the microphone, inform the public. In this crazy world where there's lots of shades of gray, it's really a black and white clear issue. Let's see, should wild animals, including rare Tule elk, there's only about 6,000 in the world, be free to wander inside a national park unit? Even hunters, as I like to say, me being a vegan activist, but even hunters would agree, yeah, well, we want them to run free and flourish in a national park. And then we can move them out somewhere and hunt them if they want to do that. But no one would say, yeah, inside a national park, wildlife should be fenced, their population artificially controlled to benefit cattle ranches that are operating inside a national park. What's with that? It just reeks to high heaven.
Now, I want to ask a question. And actually, I want to, before we get to the second lawsuit and the Park Service, I just want to say that Secretary Haaland has turned out to be, certainly in my opinion, and probably a widely held opinion by anyone concerned with both the environment and wildlife, probably the worst Secretary of Interior we've ever had. Boy, I thought Gail Norton was bad. I thought Salazar was bad, but she has turned out to be the worst Secretary of Interior for just about any animal. Of course, she's a rancher herself, so she sides with them, and that's also part of the problem. So I just want to get that in. So I did want to ask, what happens to these elk if they stray into, the area where the dairy cows are? The ranchers call the Park Service, and then what happens to these elk?
That's a simple question and a good one, but there's no one simple answer to it. It depends which of the three areas the elk wander out of and then where they wander into. So as we activists, or for that matter, tourists drive into the park, I mean, it's an amazing place. There's a free admission to Point Reyes National Seashore. It's a relatively little park, and you can drive in for free 24/7 and go get into the parking lot of Tomales Point at the northernmost part of Point Reyes Seashore and likely see Tule elk either on your way in or from the parking lot. It's, like seeing, Old Faithful geyser from a parking lot. It's that kind of drive-in, see Tule elk, which is kind of a mixed blessing. I mean, it's great, and I wouldn't mind if that were so, as long as they also could wander and multiply, and there could be more elk in the park in other areas where they were not confined and, of course, suffering. Nobody wants that. I just wanted to back up, too. As far as Haaland, I just want to make this is a political assessment, so it's not like I know any truth that you don't know. I'm very disappointed in her, as are you, of course. I just see the problem as bigger than any one Secretary of the Interior. I'm old enough to remember James Watt.
Oh, I remember James Watt under Reagan. Gail Norton was his protege. I remember James. He wanted to dam up the Grand Canyon and use it for recreation. Yes.
So I go far enough back, I'm becoming one of the old people like, well, I remember World War II, and it was really bad, and I remember the peace marches, so you think Trump is something, blah, blah, blah. And the country is falling. Well, it was pretty tough during the 60s, too, and I was a little kid.
Yeah.
But Watts was a spokesman for big business and vociferously anti-wildlife. At least she isn't that. And I'm not happy about that.
Right.
And I'm very disappointed in her. But I realize the big villain of this piece is the cattle industry.
Yeah.
The cattle industry. And it's so powerful that it has the so-called somewhat democratic Biden administration under its thumb as well. And if she spoke up, she should have decided, oh, the heck with it, I'm going to speak my conscience. And I'm a Native American and I believe in Native American rights and we should have this land restored and get the cattle industry out because they're polluting it with methane and huge amounts of manure and degrading the land. Regenerative ranching is BS. By the way, I'll say that a few times through this broadcast because it's like, oh, isn't that a good thing? It isn't. And I've even got a webpage up about it called Regenerative BS on my TreeSpirit project site. And it's just, that's their pushback. That means we're having effect. You know, they start fighting you, as Gandhi would say. Ignore you, you're not being effective. So Deb Haaland, if she spoke up and did that, the Biden administration would, the cattle industry would scream at the Biden administration and she'd be outed. That would be it, or ousted, excuse me. That would be the end of it. Yeah. Not that she shouldn't do it. I would love that. It would become a great, she would write a book and all that, but it hasn't happened and I'm not surprised. That's all. So I'm sorry. What was your question?
Oh, the second lawsuit.
Okay, second lawsuit was brought about a year after the first one. They are both ongoing, and that was brought by 3 environmental groups: Resource Renewal Institute, Western Watersheds Project.
I know them.
Center for Biological Diversity under Jeff Miller. Big of those 3, but there are 3 great organizations working for environmental rights and in some cases animal rights. True conservationists, I would say, before conservation was taken over by those who want to kill animals with herbicides and pesticides and all that stuff. And they are in negotiations now. And I still have a little bit of hope that some good might come from that, and that maybe Congressman Huffman of California might help negotiations along and encourage the cattle industry to at least agree to gradually get out of Point Reyes Seashore. It's possible. Lawsuits help. They apply political pressure along with, you know, what citizens can do and what activists can do and getting all this moving. So, yeah, that's the second one. And they're focused, I'm sorry, on the environmental concerns, more demonstrating the massive land degradation and water pollution and, of course, air pollution with methane of the approximately 4,500, 5,000 cows in the park. Compare that with about 500 elk. So for every one wild Tule elk in the park, there are 9, cows, which are in there purely to make money. They eat grass off the land. They have to truck in more seed and more water because cows eat a lot. They're big animals, 2 to 3 times the size of any elk in the park. And they're an extractive industry, as the great Ken Brower, an environmentalist and author and a mentor of mine, has taught me. They're an extractive industry, completely different from how elk are on the land. Even if you rotate them around in their little paddocks, they're so-called rotational grazing, which is part of the regenerative BS public relations pushback.
And also the elk are indigenous and the cow is not, just like the wild horse and the wolf and the bison. And so when our wildlife is being pushed to the brink for, you know, a non-native species, that impacts everything. There was a hearing last year by the California Coastal Commission. I know that you attended. I attended it myself. Would you like to shed some light on what transpired at that, I'll call it a hearing for lack of a better word, where the public was allowed to very briefly give more than just their names? You want to talk about it? You want to
well, we should do a rat-a-tat-tat back and forth on this, just peck at it, because, you know, I'm glad that there are so-called public meetings, which have, you know, of course, been diminished and changed radically with Zoom and the whole culture going online, which it's not like I'm against it. I mean, like right now, you and I are talking from, you know, miles apart, and you can have these great meetings and lots of people can weigh in from around the country for, in this case, a national park issue, national seashore, where people come and visit Point Reyes from everywhere, and a California-wide issue. So you're not going to, even if you could have a public meeting during the pandemic or now after the pandemic, what do you get, 100, 200 people in the room? Whereas on Zoom, you can have 1,000 people attend in theory. Yeah, so that's great. But as we were discussing this beforehand, originally it was 5 minutes. You said, I don't go that far back. I remember when it was 3 minutes. And then they cut it to 2 minutes. And then if a lot of people show up for a meeting, they're allowed within the rules. Is it legal? Yeah. Is it ethical? No. Is it democratic? Not particularly. To cut it to 1 minute comment. And in 1 minute, it just becomes a dog and pony show where you just say something, I'm Jack, I'm really upset, blah, blah, blah. Oh, time's up. Bye. Thank you. Next.
Exactly.
It's just, in my opinion, and I am old enough to have been involved in in-person meetings before Zoom,
Me
before,
too. Me too.
and I went to in-person meetings in the Bay Area, and sometimes there were 100 people in the room or 150 people, and the meeting went till 1 in the morning.
Wow.
And
Nobody will do that anymore. Nobody does like
well,
that anymore. Yeah.
to be fair, the public officials are not, and the commissioners certainly are not paid much.
Right.
And they work huge hours and they work many issues. I do have compassion for their situation, but at a certain point, it's like, tough darts, guy. You took a job, you're still getting paid 100 grand or 120 grand or 90 grand or whatever. It's a decent salary these days. And you got to put in the hours. It's public service. And we, the people, have to be heard somewhere. So I'm pissed at the system. It's a complicated fix. Other than I would say is we should be given at minimum 3 minutes. And if 100 people show up and that's 300 minutes, tough. I mean, that's democracy. It's messy and long, and it has to be that. And if you just keep cutting it down because of, for time, it's absurd. There's no more democracy, which we're seeing the whittling away of now for other reasons.
Yeah. And as we talked before the show, even though we're both New Yorkers and we can talk fast,
You got a problem with that, lady?
you can't get very much in 60 seconds. And certainly if you had anything of any kind of detail or any kind of like backstory, you can't possibly. So it really is kind of like a dog and pony show. And you would think that the California Coastal Commission, just by their title, would be more concerned with the coast. And as you mentioned, the water, you want to talk a little bit about the quality of the water at
Let's
at the
just finish up.
seashore?
Yes, remind me of that, would you, on your notes there? Because I'm not taking notes. But the Coastal Commission meeting, what happened was they did the what I call the, I don't know. I've got to come up with a better name for it. I haven't taken the time to come up with some marketing title for it, but it's the BS Coastal Commission two-step, where
Yeah.
they say, well, we don't want to do this. We don't want to do this. They don't let the public weigh in. They have so-called experts advising the commission, but they don't allow so-called experts on the activist side counter the BS spewing from the so-called experts who are all in with approving whatever the crazy plan is.
Right.
Cockamamie, we would say, right?
Right. Cockamamie, yes.
We're going to clean it up. They've been polluting the seashore for 20, 30 years. Yeah, we know that, but they promised to do better. So as long as they promised, it's like, who would sit for that nonsense? They've been polluting for 20, 30 years, so you give them a free pass. And not only that, but you give what was called a conditional concurrence. We'll let you move ahead with this plan to keep cattle in there for another 25 years, ignoring the testimony that says they were paid money and didn't leave, and they're the number one source of, as I say, land degradation, water pollution, air pollution in the park. Why on earth would you let them stay? What possible legitimate argument for that can there be? So they gave a conditional concurrence, and that's the first step of the two-step. The second step is then when you have the second meeting where the agency, the Park Services, comes in and says, yeah, we worked it out, the ranchers agree to the terms. No discussion, no revote, no public input again. We're terrified they're just going to say, okay, they came in, they made the concurrence, we're going ahead. So it's sort of like, don't worry about that. Trust us for later is the first step. And then when later comes to say, well, we already settled this, we gave a concurrence. And that is it's fitting for Mitch McConnell, let's put it that way. Someone who knows how to play the game brilliantly to legal but unethical effect. So that meeting is, when is the CCC meeting? I should know that off the top of my head. I'm sorry. I think it's later this year in the fall. I'm sorry, I can come up with that if we need it. But when they will come back and say, and then we activists are like hair trigger ready to jump all over that and make a huge stink in the media and on that meeting and invite people to participate and scream and yell, because there are a couple of commissioners who actually are sympathetic, I would say, to the plight of the elk and rational. Anyone who's, it's such a clear-cut issue. That's why I'm so fired up about it. It's not one of those like, well, I don't know, how do you cut fossil fuels when we're driving so many cars and people, not everybody can afford a Tesla or a Chevy Volt or whatever. But having cattle grazed in a national park while subsidized heavily by the public, the cost of meat and milk in the nation is heavily subsidized. It would be 3 times as much instead of the subsidies going to, vegetable replacements, plant-based replacements that don't destroy our our environment, what we need to live on and breathe in. It's crazy making.
It is. And a lot of the public, I mean, I don't know what people are doing on the internet. Well, I know what people are doing on the internet. They're not researching what's in their food supply. I can tell you that, because even in 2023, for God's sakes, 2023, I've been at this since the 1980s. People still don't know what's in their food supply, and they don't seem to grasp, or they don't seem to want to grasp, uh, how all of this grazing with these cows on public lands like permanently damages the land and the water. And it's not just some stream in a national park, all that water eventually flows into your water supply. So you are drinking all of that too. Your produce is grown in all of that contamination. So this isn't like an isolated issue. It's not something that's just contained. And a lot of people are quite surprised that grazing is done on public lands for pennies on the dollar, and in particular in like national parks. The National Park Service has kind of a sketchy history. Originally, when they were first formed, they were the first of like the public agencies, and when they were first formed, the park rangers were kind of like hunters, and they would kind of go into the national parks and kind of clean it out of all the predators to make it more, kind of safe for humans and the herbivores, which obviously did not scare people. And then they kind of switched to where they were actually more of a conservation kind of agency, protecting our native wildlife. Species would go on the endangered list, and there would be some sort of conservation program. And then they switched back to what they had been originally, though I think they're going even worse than what they had originally were, where they are allowing not just, I think they're actually expanding, allowing cattle to graze in national parks, but they are allowing hunting of native wildlife in national parks. A lot of people don't know this, but the National Park Service has sanctioned at least 3 or 4 years ago hunting of wild animals like the mountain goats, which could have been transported to Oregon, but Park Service chose not to, and bison, which is kind of the epitome of irony, because the bison is on the logo of the National Park Service, and yet they're allowing them to be hunted by outside hunters. They don't need to be called. They're not sick. They're not endangering anyone. This is all just BS, cowing to the hunting industry and the ag industry. But they do allow outside hunters to come in. They don't close the park, so tourists are there when this is going on. And they shoot moving animals that are not penned in. This is the National Park Service. So it probably shouldn't come as a surprise that they are doing this to the elk.
So I have a spot quiz for the audience.
Yes.
Spot quiz. Ready?
Uh-oh.
This is a 5 or 6 part question. I'm not sure how many parts it's going to be, but I want an answer for each of these. And pay attention. It's a trick question.
Uh-oh.
Why are they allowing the hunting of mountain goats? I assume you're referring to Grand Tetons. First question. Second, why are they allowing Tule Elk to be fenced at Point Reyes? Third question, why are they allowing bison to be shot and killed by over 1,000 recently in Yellowstone? Fourth question, pay attention, folks. There's going to be an answer at the end of this for you guys to answer. Why do they allow the shooting of wolves across the West in many areas? And let's see, Staci, any others? Any other animal species? Mountain lions are not targeted so often.
Well, actually, one of the conditions.
Coyotes. Oh my God.
And also elk in what is the park right outside of Yellowstone National Park? Grand Teton. Grand Teton. When Grand Teton was formed as a national park, the concession that the federal government made to allow this beautiful area to be made a national park was to allow, wait for it, hunting of elk inside the park. That might have been the first one.
So the question is, audience, why? What's the answer? Why would that be allowed? And I'll give you a hint. It's a 3-letter or 4-letter answer, depending on whether it's singular or plural. Cows, or cattle, if you prefer. All of those animals are killed, hunted, confined, decimated, the populations, all for the cattle industry. So this is for later on at the end of the show. It's like what you can do, how you can get involved. In case people don't last that long, I just want to say you can make a difference. Today, easily, in case you're listening to this and I'm just thinking of somebody who's listening to this for the first time and it's really upsetting, and I don't want to hear another 20 minutes of these people getting me really upset about how bad it is. There's something you can do, and it's just eat less cow products, eat less beef, drink less dairy or cheese. You don't even have to go, as I like to say, go vegan and travel, to the fifth brightest star in the sky, Vega, to become a vegan. Just eat less of these products, and you immediately reduce the market for it. That's how empowered we are as consumers in this crazy consumerist society.
It is. What and how you spend your money says to everybody, not just the companies making the products, but it says it to the media that reports on the news, whether or not they're going to pick up a story, the government, what they're going to subsidize, and the public in general, whether or not they're going to tolerate something, what you prioritize. And clearly, I can't think of anything that's not more important than your food supply and your drinking water. So, like I said at the beginning, animal issues are not just about animals. They really impact everyone's economics and politics in ways that people don't even understand. So this has been going on with the elk for decades. Obviously, this I'll just say abuse of them. What do you think? What you see as the future for the elk? I'm trying to find some kind of positive, good news in all of
so
this.
I'm oddly
if there is any,
No, there is. I'm oddly optimistic. I mean, for fighting the cattle industry, that's a much bigger fight. And until the public starts shifting on that, until we get to say, there's a guy named Will Tuttle, who's another teacher of mine, who says sort of like 17% is his number of like when there's a turning point, when enough people shift that it starts to begin to infect the public consciousness. We're not there yet, but certainly, veganism, that whole movement is growing, even if that's a strange or dirty word to you. Just becoming more aware of the effect of the cattle industry on the planet. But at Point Reyes, it's a much smaller issue in an educated area of the Bay Area, environmentally conscious people. Like me, I was into my 50s before I was willing to look at the truth of why not even the elk were there, but the story about the cattle industry, which is the story of Point Reyes. So in this case, it's a national park. We activists as a collective and a lot of citizens, thousands of people, like the thousands of new people hopefully listening to this podcast, can make a difference by just speaking up with friends and neighbors and talking about this stuff. You can turn on MSNBC and they're not going to touch the cattle industry. They'll go on another story about Trump, which is certainly important for obvious reasons. But the cattle industry, fouling the atmosphere, pumping out more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere globally, not just in America, but certainly here as well, than the entire transportation sector. And if that's a new term to you, that means all the world's, think about that, all the world's cars, planes, trucks, buses, motorcycles, jitneys. Did I say planes? I sure did. But think about that. All of those combined, the emissions from all those don't equal the amount of emissions coming out of mostly the front end, but also the back end of cows around the world.
Right.
I mean, that's just, to take that in, to really accept that, is like accepting Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, that there is no there. It's just, we are electrons moving around with predictabilities about where we might be. We're not solid material like, this guy Jack is crazy. No wonder he's got that crazy last name no one can pronounce. But as far as cows goes, that's I was listening to some commentary. That's a known. Like, it's not, or hidden in plain sight. That's just simple stuff where cows produce methane, they degrade the soil, they pollute the land with manure and fecal bacteria just to make yummy, tasty beef products I grew up on. We all grew up on. If you're willing to back off some of that, you can do something today. I keep returning to that optimistic note. You as a consumer can make a difference today, to quote Captain Kirk, just for today. You cannot be a killer, just for today.
It is hard for people to grasp how cows, and they do have sweet faces, I get that, but it is hard for people to grasp how cows can somehow be a greater threat to our drinking water and food supply and the land that we grow our food on than, when you're driving behind a bus with the exhaust pipe, or a plane with all of that. But it really is true. And it's not a secret. It's been known for quite a long time. It's just that people can they can give up certain things like, okay, so I won't fly in a plane, maybe I'll drive, instead, or maybe we'll carpool or, things of that nature. But when it comes to food, that's like the last holdout. People will give up a ton of other things, but it's like, I don't want to give up my steak, or I don't want to give up that. And they just don't, I think they just don't want to grasp or acknowledge the truth. I did want to ask you, because I know that you were involved, and this might have occurred more than once, but there were actually volunteers that were bringing water to the elk during some of the droughts you had mentioned earlier.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, ironically, when it's worst for the elk, when there's a demonstrable in the news, real severe drought in California, which is still here, by the way. It's not at the moment, but it's inevitable to return, whether it's this summer,
Right,
or
right,
autumn, or next summer, next autumn. Summers are getting hotter and drier on average.
exactly. Yeah.
That's going to happen. The elk are going to suffer. The land is going to suffer. So during that time, I was, again, with a group of activists. I'm also a photographer. So the ponds, the few ponds that are remnants of cattle ponds before it was converted to the national park, had water in them. And then in the summer, they dried up. And there were elk dying, and there was more bodies being found. Photographers documenting that who were activists, citizen activists. So we could use that horrible suffering of elk and dying of elk and rotting corpses to show people and say, look, we're going to bring water in and put water in these ponds. It's kind of a futile gesture. We can't bring enough water. It's incredibly heavy. We don't have permission to do it. It wasn't technically breaking the law, but you're not supposed to, bring things into a park. We figured, well, we're bringing in water. We'll take the citation for that if it happens. I was cited a couple times, but didn't suffer any horrible injury. We were peaceful, cordial, respectful of the Park Service rangers because they're not the villains of this piece. It's like blaming the cop on the beat for something that he's ordered to do. And there can be abuses by anybody in any system, of course. But in this case, we brought water in. It was very visual. It was easy for the average person to understand. Dying elk, emaciated elk with ribs showing. They're starving. We're going to bring water in. Are you with us? Yeah. And people came in. We had hundreds of people helping 6 different times. I was involved in all 6 of those. I didn't organize the first one, but I became one of the league organizers for bringing water in 5 more times. It was very effective. Currently, and that's, by the way, again, another optimistic note. I search for them. I need them too. That's what pressured politically and through the media, the Park Service, to say, oh, well, they don't really need water. They're not dying of thirst. It's because there's not enough rain to make adequate forage, vegetation, to give the elk the nutrition they need. So we'll install water tanks and water troughs, which they did.
Okay.
Never conceding this practical point that the elk need water. They just said, well, they need it for the forage, and we'll put them there as a modicum of care. And that was, of course, the result of pressure. And again, you don't admit when an activist group is successful, because then that just encourages the buggers, right?
Exactly. Well, I saw the pictures, and you see this big giant fence, and then you see all these activists carrying up all this water, and it's kind of like, what must the Rangers be thinking? I mean, obviously they're not going to tell you the truth, but if you could read their mind, what must they be thinking when they see this? I mean, clearly it is ass backwards what is going on, and yet I guess none of the Rangers will really speak up, and of course the Park Service has kind of sold out to the ranchers too. But those pictures are very powerful of the people bringing the water.
I'll give a shout out to Diana Oppenheim, who ran, I think, forelk.org. When I first saw that documentary film, Shame of Point Reyes, she was in the room working with Skyward Thomas to promulgate these issues. So I met her, and she was very active for a couple of years, and she's moved to take care of her mom, and she's not as active in that right now. She was a Tule Elk volunteer, a volunteer in the park, and she worked with Tule Elk, and she wanted to, as you said, suggested wisely, rightly, she spoke out about it in her spare time. She didn't like wear a ranger suit and walk around talking about the elk, but she spoke about it, and they said, stop doing that. And she said, no, I won't stop speaking the truth about these poor animals that I've come to love,
right?
When it's my own time, and posting on social media and stuff. So they let her go. They said, no, you can't. And she was volunteer of the year. for the park because she's a hard worker. And they said, nope, you're out of here. So that's, of course, what would happen to any ranger who dared spoke up and was outspoken about the truth. They would, at the very least, be transferred, if not fired. That's why they don't speak up. So depending on your degree of judgment or impatience, you will think them villains, or in my case, I choose to work with them. So I choose to be more political and diplomatic and say, I understand. As long as they're not screaming and yelling at me and arresting me, which they're not, I'm cordial with them. I understand their situation. We do our activism in the park. And the trick is always to, what's the current issue we can leverage with a dramatic action to get public attention and attract media. And that's an ongoing, strategic talks, blah, 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 about how do you do that. Right now, there's no drought in California. We had a really wet, thank goodness, wet winter. And it's been a really cool spring. It's not summer till the 22nd, technically, and we still haven't had a big heat wave yet. So the elk are actually, their numbers have been diminished over the years, but currently, right now, there's no immediate crisis. There's just the ongoing low burn of these animals are still penned. The park is still being polluted actively by dairy operations that have no business being there. They've been paid to leave. Snafu is the military term, going back another generation from my father. Situation normal, all effed up. And we do have, I think on the link you'll provide, dying Tule Elk video. There was an activist in the park on a Friday night in November who came upon something very unusual. He walked out, as he often did, along the fence line and came upon an elk, a big bull elk with a big full head of, I was going to say a head of hair, head of antlers, lying on the ground, unable to get up, but not dead, and lifting his head and in some sort of level of distress or pain. It's hard to tell. Wild animals don't show it the way we humans do. And it's poignant and disturbing. And, you want to put the animal out of his misery, but you don't know whether that's the right thing to do. Do you try to call the Park Service and get somebody out there to do something about that elk that's on the ground that can't get up and is now scared as you approach to film and to sort of see what's happened and whether you can help that poor animal? Not emaciated, not bleeding, not shot. Who knows what's going on there? Poison from something he ate or drank, impossible to tell. But it's just no one, including the most heartless hunter, wants to see an animal suffering like that. It's just not something you can bear, and especially if you're an animal person. It's heartbreaking. So there's a video of that animal, and there's a voiceover for it, and it's what's going to go on there. It's a depiction of what happens with elk that are dying in there for reasons unknown, including thirst and starvation.
And where's this video? Where can people see this video?
I sent you a link to it. It's on
There
YouTube.
is a link. Okay.
Yeah, and In Defense of Animals has posted it in their Instagram and Twitter feeds. I know Instagram for sure. Anybody can reach out to me too, by the way, just directly at Jack G. That's my last initial, Jack G at idausa.org or Jack at TreeSpiritProject.org. Both those emails get to me, and I'm happy to communicate with anybody about this issue and send links. And you're going to be putting up a link to that as well. I will send you. Staci.
Yes, and you also sent a link for the Shame of Point Reyes?
I haven't, but I will. I didn't know that would come up as a topic of conversation. Certainly.
Yes, I would be interested. So before we end the show, is there any final thought that you would like to leave with listeners to motivate them to eat less beef or get involved or contact you?
Well, please do check the links, which Staci-lee will post to both indefenseofanimals.org/elk. There is an action you can take, which is our Congressman Huffman here of the district, which encompasses the park, can still be pressed on. That's our current go-to if people want to write somebody and say, this is nonsense. I heard about this issue, and I think elk should be freed in a national park and cattle operations should be out of a national park, with Congressman Jared Huffman. But again, the link on the In Defense of Animals page will lead you there. Staci-lee will provide those. My website is treespiritproject.com/elk will lead you to my elk page. And I would go back to the bigger picture, which is, well, three things. Cattle, cattle, cattle. Right. So the thing you can do, here's the good news. The biggest thing you can do to save the planet, to probably improve your health, to do what your grandma said to do, which was eat your vegetables, and stop the slaughtering of wildlife in this country, is to back off eating beef and eat, especially, oddly enough, if you're new to this issue, eat a lot less dairy. Dairy cows actually have more of a polluting effect, and it's a more brutal existence because you make a cow pregnant against her will, take her baby away. That's how you get the cow's milk. And then the baby cows are sent off either to slaughter or to the veal industry. Right. A horrific fate. Or the females are then become the next layer of the next generation of cows that are used for their milk. It's turning a beautiful living sentient being. Cows are not the problem. It's what humans do to them.
Right.
Into a slave from which we extract meat and milk because it tastes good, just because, it's good on the palate. It's great when you get to the vegan world, you sort of see things from a far back view and like, wow, this is crazy. And I was completely oblivious to it because, I'm going to be 63 in a week, and I didn't know any of that, and I didn't want to know it. I have nothing but compassion for people who hear this stuff and just grimace or recoil in horror. I don't want to hear this. It's upsetting. I know. I get it. The good news is if you move toward it just a little bit and eat less meat, it's good for you. It's good for the planet. It's good for your mother, Earth. It doesn't take much effort, and there's tons of yummy other products out there to eat now that don't involve torturing animals.
And the thing about the Tule Elk is that the longer that this goes on, it perpetuates death and violence and abuse, not just to the elk, but also to the dairy cows. And it degrades our drinking water and land and food supply, which also is kind of self-destructive to our own species. You would think people would care about that too. So this whole thing is just perpetuation, destruction, and it's completely unnecessary. So all of these links will be listed on this podcast if people want to get involved, and I hope that they do. So I hope that the listeners have enjoyed the show, and tune in next time. I cover many topics that you won't read about in the news, so there's a little something for everybody. I also encourage people to check out some of the other podcasts on All About Animal Radio. They have some terrific shows that you will find interesting, and that is a wrap. Thank you very much, Jack, for being on the show.
Thank you so much, Staci-lee. Very much appreciated.